Lillian Carter was 32, the kind of woman who could slip through a room unnoticed. And that's exactly how she liked it. She worked at the dusty little library on Maple Street, a quiet corner of a small American town where the loudest sound was the creak of old wooden shelves. Books were her refuge, rows of worn spines that didn't judge, didn't ask questions, didn't demand she explain the shadows that clung to her like a second skin. She'd spend her days shelving novels, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, her hazel eyes darting away whenever someone lingered too long at the counter. People didn't scare her, not exactly. It was closeness she couldn't stand. For years, she'd built her life around solitude. She lived in a tiny apartment above a bakery, the smell of bread drifting up through the floorboards every morning. She didn't have friends who dropped by, didn't go to the town's annual fair, didn't even own a pet. It wasn't that she hated company, it was that she didn't trust it. And the reason why was buried deep, a jagged memory from when she was 17. Back then, she'd been a shy high school kid, awkward in her own skin, sent for a routine health check at the local clinic. The doctor, an older man with cold hands and a wide smile, had crossed a line. His touch lingered where it shouldn't have. His words slithered into something she couldn't unhear, and when she'd frozen, too scared to scream, he'd acted like it was nothing. She told her parents, her school counselor. Nobody believed her. "You're too dramatic, Lillian," her mom had said, exasperated. "He's a professional," the counselor added, flipping through her file. So she stopped talking about it, stopped trusting, stopped letting anyone near. Now, 15 years later, she was still that girl in some ways, still quiet, still guarded, but she'd learned to live with it. Or so she thought. Lately, though, something had been off. A dull ache had settled in her chest, right beneath her ribs, faint at first but growing sharper over time. She'd ignored it for months, popping aspirin like candy, telling herself it was stress or bad posture from hunching over books all day. But one Tuesday morning, as she stacked a pile of returned mysteries, the pain hit like a fist. She dropped the books, clutching the edge of the counter, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Her coworker, an older woman named Margie, rushed over, her voice sharp with worry. "Lillian, you're white as a sheet. You need a doctor. Now." "I'm fine," Lillian muttered, but even she didn't believe it. The pain lingered, a cruel reminder that her body wasn't going to let her hide forever. Margie wouldn't let it go either. She practically dragged Lillian to her car and drove her to the hospital, muttering about stubbornness the whole way. At the front desk, Lillian's hands shook as she filled out the forms, her pen hovering over the box for preferred doctor gender. She checked female 3 times, underlining it for good measure. She couldn't handle a man poking at her, not again. The receptionist smiled, took the clipboard, and told her to wait. 20 minutes later, a nurse called her name. Lillian stood, her legs unsteady, following the woman down a sterile hallway that smelled of bleach and fear. "You'll be seeing Dr. Julian Pierce today," the nurse said cheerfully, pushing open a door. Lillian stopped cold. "Wait, Julian, that's a man's name, isn't it?" Her voice cracked, her palms already sweating. The nurse turned, surprised. "Yes, Dr. Pierce is male. He's one of our best cardiologists. Is that a problem?" Lillian's heart slammed against her chest. I asked for a woman," she stammered, taking a step back. The nurse frowned, glancing at her chart. "I'm so sorry, there must have been a mix-up. But Dr. Pierce is incredible. You're in good hands, I promise." Lillian's throat tightened. She wanted to run, to disappear, but the ache in her chest pulsed harder, pinning her in place. She had no choice. Lillian stood frozen in the doorway, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the linoleum floor. The exam room was small, too small, with its white walls and a single chair that looked more like a trap than a seat. She clutched her bag tighter, her knuckles whitening as the nurse gestured her inside. "Dr. Pierce will be right with you," she said, her tone chipper, oblivious to the storm brewing in Lillian's chest. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. She didn't sit. She couldn't. Her eyes darted to the exam table, the stirrups glinting under the fluorescent light, and her stomach twisted. She'd been here before. Not this room, not this hospital, but this feeling, exposed, trapped, waiting for someone to walk in and take something she couldn't get back. The knock came, soft but sudden, jolting her like a gunshot. "Miss Carter, may I come in?" The voice was calm, deep, not at all what she'd expected. She didn't answer, just stared at the door, her breath shallow. It creaked open anyway, and there he was, Dr. Julian Pierce. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his white coat. His hair was dark, slightly messy, like he'd run his hands through it one too many times, and his eyes green, steady, locked onto hers with a gentleness that caught her off guard. He was younger than she'd pictured, maybe 35, and there was no coldness in him, no arrogance, just a quiet confidence that made the room feel less hostile. "Lillian, right?" he said, stepping in and setting a clipboard on the counter. His voice was warm, like a crackling fire on a winter night, and it almost eased the knot in her chest. "I'm Julian Pierce. I hear there was a mix-up with your appointment. If you're not okay with this, we can figure something else out. No pressure." He stayed near the door, giving her space, his hands resting loosely at his sides. She didn't respond, couldn't. Her throat felt like it was closing, her mind screaming at her to bolt. He tilted his head slightly, reading her silence. "How about we start with why you're here? You don't have to sit if you don't want to. We can just talk." "It's my chest," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It hurts, for a while now." She kept her arms crossed, a shield against him, against everything. Julian nodded, his expression softening. "Okay, that's a good place to start. Can you tell me more? When it started, how it feels?" He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her, just stood there, patient. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Months, I guess. Dull at first, but now it's sharp, like something's pressing down." Her fingers dug into her sleeves, her nails biting into her skin. "Sounds like it's been rough," he said, his tone genuine, not patronizing. "Mind if I check your pulse? Just your wrist, nothing more. You say stop, I stop." He took a small step forward, slow, waiting for her to react. She tensed, her heart racing, but she didn't say no. Maybe it was the pain, maybe it was exhaustion, but she nodded stiffly. He approached, careful, like he was handling something fragile. His fingers brushed her wrist, light as a feather, and she flinched, hard. It wasn't him, not really. It was the memory crashing back. Those other hands, heavier, unwanted, pinning her down 15 years ago. Her breath hitched, her vision blurring. "Don't touch me!" she yelled, yanking her arm back so fast she stumbled into the table. The metal clanged, loud and jarring, and Julian stepped back instantly, hands raised, eyes wide with surprise. "Hey! I'm sorry, I didn't mean," he started, but she was already moving. "Don't!" she snapped, her voice raw, trembling. She grabbed her bag and shoved past him, the door banging against the wall as she fled. Her sneakers pounded the hallway, her chest screaming with every step, but she didn't stop, not until she was outside, gulping cold air in the parking lot. She sank onto a bench, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her face. The pain was still there, gnawing at her ribs, but it was the panic that drowned her now. She saw it all again, the clinic room at 17, the doctor's leering grin, the way he'd laughed when she squirmed. She'd told herself she was over it, that time had dulled the edges, but one touch, one accidental, clinical touch, and she was that scared kid again. Tears burned her eyes, hot and angry. She hated this, hated herself for breaking, hated that she couldn't just be normal. Back in the exam room, Julian stood alone, the clipboard still on the counter. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. He'd seen fear before, patients who hated needles, who dreaded bad news. But this was different. This was bone deep, primal. He hadn't meant to push, hadn't even come close to crossing a line, but something had snapped in her and it left him rattled. He didn't know her story, didn't know what had sent her running, but he felt it in his gut. This wasn't about him. It was about something older, something she'd carried too long. He glanced at the door she'd disappeared through, his jaw tightening. Whatever it was, he wouldn't forget her face, or the way she'd looked at him like he was a ghost she couldn't outrun. The days after Lillian's panicked escape from the hospital blurred into a haze of avoidance. She called in sick to the library, claiming a cold, but Margie's skeptical on the phone told her the excuse wasn't fooling anyone. She stayed holed up in her apartment, the curtains drawn tight, the only sound the hum of the radiator and the occasional clatter of pans from the bakery downstairs. The pain in her chest hadn't gone away, It lingered like an unwelcome guest. Sharp one minute, dull the next. But she couldn't face going back. Not to that hospital, not to any doctor. She'd rather grit her teeth through it than let someone near her again. By Friday, though, her stash of aspirin was running low and the library was short-staffed. Margie had left a voicemail, her tone equal parts annoyed and worried. "Lillian, we've got a shipment of new books coming in, and I can't lift those boxes alone. Get your butt back here." Lillian sighed, rubbing her temples. She couldn't hide forever. So she pulled on a faded sweater, tied her hair back, and trudged the 3 blocks to work, the autumn wind biting at her cheeks. The library smelled like it always did, old paper and polished wood, and for a moment she felt steady again, surrounded by her books. She was halfway through unpacking a crate of dusty hardcovers when the bell above the door jingled. She didn't look up, just kept sorting, assuming it was one of the regulars, maybe old Mr. Hensley looking for another war memoir. But then a voice broke through the quiet, low and familiar. "Excuse me, do you have anything by Austen? My mom's a fan." Lillian's hands froze mid-motion, a copy of Pride and Prejudice slipping from her fingers. She knew that voice. She turned slowly, and there he was, Julian Pierce, standing in the middle of her sanctuary, a small notebook tucked under his arm. He wasn't in his white coat this time, just a navy jacket and jeans, but those green eyes were unmistakable. He blinked, recognition dawning on his face. "Lillian?" he said, almost like a question. She felt her throat close up, her pulse kicking into overdrive. "What are you doing here?" she asked, sharper than she meant to. He raised a hand, a little defensive. "I didn't know you worked here, I swear. I just came to find something for my mom. She's stuck in bed after a knee surgery, and she loves classics." His words were careful, like he was stepping around broken glass. She crossed her arms, her walls slamming back into place. "I don't need an apology," she said, cutting off whatever he was about to say next. "Just get your book and go." Julian nodded, his jaw tightening slightly, but he didn't argue. He moved to the fiction section, browsing quietly while she turned back to her crate, her hands trembling. She hated how small she felt, how his presence turned her safe little world upside down. He didn't linger. 10 minutes later, he paid for a worn copy of Sense and Sensibility and left without another word. But the air felt heavier after he was gone, like he'd left something behind she couldn't shake. That encounter should have been the end of it. She told herself it was random, meaningless, over. But fate, or maybe just bad luck, had other plans. 3 nights later, she was walking home late after closing up. The streets were empty, the sky a bruised purple, and she'd taken the shortcut through the park to save time. The ache in her chest was nagging again, a steady throb. But she pushed it down, focusing on the crunch of leaves under her boot. Then she heard it. Footsteps, heavy and uneven, trailing behind her. She glanced back and saw a figure, a man in a ratty jacket, his eyes glassy with too much liquor. "Hey, pretty lady," he slurred, stumbling closer. "Where are you going so fast?" Her heart leapt into her throat. She quickened her pace, but he matched her, his voice growing louder. "Come on, don't be rude." She broke into a run, her chest screaming in protest, but he lunged, grabbing her sleeve. She yanked free, panic flooding her veins, and then headlights sliced through the dark. A car screeched to a stop and a figure bolted out, shouting, "Back off! Now!" It was Julian. He shoved the guy away, stepping between them, his stance firm but not violent. "Walk away," he said, his voice low, dangerous. The drunk muttered something crude, then staggered off into the shadows. Lillian stood there, trembling, her breath coming in gasps. Julian turned to her, his face softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, keeping his distance. She nodded, barely, her hands clenched into fists. "I was driving home from a late shift," he said, almost like he needed to explain. "Saw you and, well, I'm glad I did." She didn't know what to say. Her mind was a mess, torn between fear and something else, gratitude maybe, or relief. He didn't push her to talk, just waited until her breathing steadied. "Can I walk you home?" he offered. She hesitated, then nodded again. They walked in silence, him a few steps behind, close enough to feel safe but far enough not to crowd her. When they reached her building, she stopped at the door, turning to face him. "Thanks," she mumbled, barely meeting his eyes. He smiled, small and real. "Anytime. Take care, Lillian." He didn't linger, just headed back to his car, his silhouette fading into the night. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, her mind spinning. He'd helped her. Twice now, if she counted the book thing, and he hadn't asked for anything. No pity, no fuss, just quiet kindness. It didn't fit with the picture she'd painted of men, of doctors, of the world. She sank onto her couch, staring at the ceiling, the pain in her chest pulsing softly. For the first time in years, she wondered if she'd been wrong to lock everyone out. Not all of them, at least. Julian, meanwhile, drove home with his hands tight on the wheel. He couldn't get her out of his head. Not her fear in the exam room, not the way she'd flinched at his touch, not the look in her eyes tonight, wild and vulnerable. He didn't know her story, but he knew enough to see the cracks she tried to hide. He'd seen it before in patients, that haunted edge. But with her, it stuck. He pulled into his driveway, a modest house that didn't scream wealth, and sat there for a minute, the engine ticking as it cooled. He wasn't sure why he cared so much, but he did. Lillian didn't sleep much that night. She lay on her couch, a blanket pulled up to her chin, replaying the park incident over and over. The drunk, slurring voice, the grip on her sleeve, the headlights cutting through the dark. And Julian, stepping in like some kind of quiet hero she hadn't asked for. It didn't make sense. She'd spent 15 years building walls, convincing herself no one could be trusted, especially not a man in a white coat. But Julian wasn't fitting into that box, and it left her restless, unsettled. The pain in her chest throbbed, a steady reminder she couldn't ignore her body forever. But the thought of going back to him, to anyone, still twisted her stomach into knots. The next few days, she kept her head down at the library, shelving books with a focus that bordered on obsession. Margie noticed, of course. She always did. "You're quieter than usual, and that's saying something," she said one afternoon, leaning on the counter with a mug of tea. Lillian shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Just tired." Margie raised an eyebrow, but didn't push. That was the thing about Margie. She knew when to let silence sit. Still, Lillian felt the weight of her own lie. Tired didn't cover it. She was scared, confused, and maybe, just maybe, starting to wonder if she'd misjudged Julian Pierce. Then he showed up again. It was a rainy Tuesday, the kind of day that kept the library empty, and Lillian was alone behind the counter, sorting a stack of late returns. The bell jingled, and she glanced up, expecting a soggy regular. Instead, it was Julian, shaking water off his jacket, a sheepish smile on his face. "Hey," he said, holding up a plastic bag. "I owe you one. My mom loved the Austen book. She's already halfway through it." Lillian blinked, caught off guard. "You didn't have to come back," she said, her voice clipped, but softer than last time. He shrugged. "I wanted to. Plus, I brought coffee. Peace offering?" He set the bag on the counter, 2 paper cups, still steaming, and stepped back, giving her space. She hesitated, then reached for one, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "Thanks," she muttered, taking a sip. Black, no sugar, just how she liked it. She didn't ask how he'd guessed. They stood there for a moment, the rain tapping against the windows, and then he spoke again. "How've you been? Since the other night?" His tone was careful, like he was testing the waters. She tensed, but something in his eyes, genuine, not prying, kept her from shutting down. "Fine," she said. "Better than I would have been." He nodded, like that was enough. "Good, I'm glad." He didn't push, didn't ask about the hospital or her chest, just sipped his own coffee and glanced at the shelves. "You've got a great setup here. Feels like a place people can breathe." She followed his gaze, her shoulders relaxing a fraction. "It's home," she said, surprising herself with the admission. He smiled, small and real. "I get that." They talked a little after that, nothing heavy, just books and the weather, and when he left, she didn't feel cornered, she felt okay. Over the next few weeks, he became a semi-regular. He'd drop by with a coffee or a question about a book, never staying long, never crowding her. She started looking forward to it, though she'd never admit it out loud. He told her about his work. Not the flashy stuff, just the quiet moments, like helping a kid get through a heart checkup without crying. She told him about the library, the way certain books found the right people at the right time. It was easy, easier than she'd expected, and it chipped away at the fear she'd carried so long. But the pain wouldn't let her forget. One evening, as she locked up the library, it hit hard, sharp, relentless, stealing her breath. She sank to the floor, clutching her chest, her vision spotting. She fumbled for her phone and dialed Margie, who showed up in 10 minutes flat, her face pale. "You're going to the hospital, and I'm not hearing no," she said, hauling Lillian into her car. At the ER, the diagnosis came fast. A heart condition, serious but fixable with surgery. Lillian's stomach dropped. Surgery meant vulnerability, meant trusting someone with her life, and the thought made her want to run again. Margie stayed with her, holding her hand as the doctor, a woman this time, explained the procedure. But when they asked who she wanted as her surgeon, Lillian surprised herself. "Dr. Julian Pierce," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. Margie raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Lillian nodded. She wasn't sure of much, but she was sure of him. He'd earned that, step by step, without ever asking for it. Julian came to see her the next day, his face a mix of surprise and concern. "Lillian, you picked me?" he asked, sitting across from her hospital bed. "Yeah," she said, meeting his eyes. "I trust you." He didn't smile, didn't gloat, just nodded, like he understood the weight of those words. "I'll take care of you," he said, and she believed him. He walked her through every detail of the surgery, his voice calm and clear, answering her questions without rushing. She still felt the panic simmering under her skin, but it didn't own her this time. He didn't either. He gave her control, let her set the pace. The morning of the surgery, he checked on her one last time. She was in a gown, an IV dripping into her arm, staring at the ceiling. "You're going to do great," he said, his hand hovering near hers but not touching. "I know," she whispered, and it wasn't a lie. Hours later, she woke up groggy, sore, but alive, the pain in her chest replaced by a strange, fragile peace. Julian was there, slouched in a chair beside her, a cup of cold coffee in his hand. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "You made it." She managed a faint smile. "So did you." He stayed after that, not as her doctor, but as something more. Someone who brought her tea, who sat quietly while she rested, who didn't try to fix her but just stayed. And for the first time in years, Lillian didn't feel alone. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew it mattered. Lillian's recovery was slow but steady, a quiet rhythm of rest and small victories. The surgery had gone perfectly. Julian's hands, steady and sure, had fixed what her body couldn't. She spent a week in the hospital, then another at home, propped up on her couch with a stack of books Margie had dropped off. Julian checked in often, not with a stethoscope, but with a bag of takeout or a thermos of soup. He'd sit across from her, never too close, and they'd talk about the library, about his long shifts, about nothing much at all. It was comfortable, natural, and it scared her how much she liked it. For the first time in forever, she felt a crack in the armor she'd worn so long, and instead of running from it, she let it widen. But peace doesn't last when you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. It happened on a chilly Thursday, 3 weeks after the surgery. Lillian was back at the library, easing into half shifts, when Margie flipped on the little TV behind the counter. "You've got to see this," she said, her voice bright with curiosity. Lillian wandered over, wiping dust from her hands, and froze. The screen showed a local news segment, the anchor's polished voice filling the room. "Today we spotlight Dr. Julian Pierce, one of the youngest leaders in cardiology and heir to Pierce Healthcare, a multi-billion-dollar empire-shaping medicine across the state." Lillian's breath caught. There he was, Julian, smiling in a crisp suit, shaking hands with some bigwig at a gala. Photos flashed across the screen, cutting-edge hospitals, charity events, his father's stern face looming over a boardroom. "Pierce Healthcare," the anchor went on, "has revolutionized patient care, though not without its controversies." Lillian's ears rang. She gripped the counter, her knees wobbly. "A billionaire?" Margie whistled. "Your doctor's loaded, huh?" Lillian didn't answer. Her mind was racing, piecing together a puzzle she didn't want to solve. Pierce Healthcare. She'd heard that name before, long ago, buried in the haze of her worst memory. That night, alone in her apartment, she dug through old boxes she'd shoved under her bed years ago. Letters, school papers, anything from back then. Her hands shook as she found it. A faded clinic flyer from when she was 17. the one her mom had handed her before that awful checkup. At the bottom, in tiny print, a division of Pierce Healthcare. Her stomach lurched. The doctor who'd hurt her, the one nobody believed her about, had worked for Julian's family. She sat there, the paper crumpled in her fist, her chest tight. Not from the surgery, but from a betrayal she hadn't seen coming. Had Julian known? Was this all some twisted game? His kindness? His patience? Just a way to keep her quiet? To cover up his family's mess? She didn't sleep. The next morning she texted him, "Meet me at the park, now." He showed up 20 minutes later, his jacket slung over his arm, his face lighting up when he saw her, until he caught her expression. She stood by the pond, arms crossed, her eyes hard. "Who are you, Julian?" she asked, her voice low, shaking. He frowned. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer, holding up the flyer, her hand trembling. "Pierce Healthcare, your family. I saw the news, and this is where it happened. The doctor who—" She stopped, her throat closing. "Did you know?" His face changed, the color draining from it. He took the flyer, his eyes scanning it, and then he closed them like he was bracing himself. "Lillian," he said, his voice rough, "I didn't know it was you, I swear." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "Right. You just happened to pick me out of nowhere? What was it, guilt? Some rich kid's redemption project?" He shook his head, urgent now. "No, listen to me. Yes, it's my family's company. And yes, I know about the scandals, doctors they protected, things they buried. I was a kid when it started, but I saw it happen." He took a breath, his hands clenching. "I was 12 when I overheard my dad on a call telling someone to handle a complaint. I didn't understand until years later. Lawsuits, payoffs, people like you who got hurt and got ignored. It's why I became a doctor, Lillian. Not to fix their mess for them, but to do something real, something they never did. I've spent my life trying to make it right." She stared at him, her anger faltering. "You expect me to believe that?" she whispered. He met her gaze, unflinching. "I didn't know your story until just now, but I knew there were victims. I've tracked down some, helped where I could, quietly, because I didn't want it to be about me. When I met you, it wasn't about that. It was just you." She turned away, tears stinging her eyes. "You should have told me who you were." He nodded, his voice breaking. "You're right. I didn't want you to see the name first, the money, the baggage. I wanted you to see me. But I should have told you." She hugged herself, the wind cold against her skin. "I trusted you," she said, barely audible. "And now, I don't know what's real." He stepped closer, stopping when she flinched. "Everything I did was real. The coffee, the park, the surgery. None of it was a lie. I'm not my father. I'm not them." She wanted to scream, to run, but something held her there. His eyes, raw and unguarded, pleading without pushing. She thought of the drunk in the park, the way he'd stayed with her after the surgery, the quiet way he'd listened. Could that all be fake? Her head said yes, her heart said no, and the clash left her dizzy. "I need time," she said, finally turning to go. He didn't follow, just stood by the water watching her leave. "I'll wait," he called after her, soft but firm. She didn't look back, but his words echoed in her ears all the way home. That night, she sat with the flyer, staring at it until her eyes burned. She hated him, or she wanted to, but she kept seeing his face, the way it crumpled when he realized what she'd been through. He wasn't that doctor. He wasn't his father. But he was tied to them, and that hurt more than she could say. Still, a small, stubborn part of her wondered if he'd meant it, if he really had spent years trying to fix what his family broke. She didn't have answers, not yet, but she couldn't shake him either. Lillian didn't see Julian for days after that confrontation by the pond. She threw herself into the library, stacking books with a ferocity that made Margie keep her distance. The flyer sat on her kitchen table, a silent accusation she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Her chest felt fine now. The surgery had worked, but her heart was a mess, tangled up in anger and doubt and something softer she didn't want to name. She'd trusted him, let him in further than anyone since she was 17, and now every memory of him was stained with that name, Pierce Healthcare. She wanted to hate him for it, to write him off as another lie, but she couldn't. Not completely. A week later, the pain came back, Not in her chest, but in her head. A dull ache from wrestling with the same questions. Was he a fraud, or was he the man who'd sat with her through the night? She needed air, so she grabbed her coat and headed to the riverfront, a quiet stretch where the water murmured over rocks and the world felt less loud. She sat on a bench, watching the current, when footsteps crunched behind her. She knew it was him before he spoke. Julian, his hands in his pockets, his face tired but open. "I wasn't sure you'd want me here," he said, stopping a few feet away, "but I had to try." She didn't look at him, just kept her eyes on the water. "I told you I needed time." He nodded, sitting on the far end of the bench, leaving space between them. "I know. I'm not here to push. I owe you more than silence." She tensed, but he didn't stop. "After you left, I went through old records, found the complaint you filed back then. It was buried, like I thought. My dad's signature was on the dismissal. I was too young to know you then, Lillian. But I'm not too young to fix it now." Her head snapped up, her voice sharp. "Fix it? You can't fix what happened." "You're right," he said, meeting her gaze. "I can't undo it, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. I've been pushing for audits, for accountability, years of it. It's not enough, I know that, but it's why I stayed in medicine, why I fought to be different." She studied him, searching for a lie, but all she saw was exhaustion and honesty. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, softer now. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Because I didn't want you to think I was playing a role, some savior with a trust fund. I wanted you to trust me for me, not my name. It was selfish, and I'm sorry." The apology hung there, heavy and real. She looked away, her fingers twisting the hem of her coat. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Trusting you. It was hard enough before, now it feels impossible." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I get that. And if you want me gone, I'll go. But I'm here because you're not just some patient to me, Lillian. You're the strongest person I've ever met, and I'd give anything to prove I'm worth that trust again." She didn't answer right away. The river kept flowing, steady and calm, and she let it settle her thoughts. She thought of the coffee he'd brought, the way he'd chased off that drunk, the quiet hours after her surgery. Then she thought of the flyer, the years of silence, the weight of being unheard. "I don't forgive your family," she said finally, "but maybe I believe you." His shoulders relaxed, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "That's more than I deserve," he said. She shook her head. "No, it's what you've earned." From there, they didn't rush. They met at the riverfront again, then at the library, talking over coffee and books. It wasn't perfect. Some days she pulled back, haunted by old ghosts, but he stayed, patient and steady. Months later, they started something bigger. Lillian had an idea, a nonprofit for women like her, survivors of medical trauma, a place to speak and be heard. Julian threw himself into it, using his name and resources to make it real. They called it Echoes of Care, and it grew. Support groups, legal aid, a quiet corner in the library with a sign that read "Safe Pages," where women left notes of hope for each other. One evening, by the river, where it all turned around, Julian pulled out a small ring, a simple band, nothing flashy. "I don't want to fix you," he said, his voice low. "I just want to be with you. Marry me?" She looked at him, the man who'd seen her break and stayed anyway, and said yes. The wedding was small, just them and a handful of people, under a willow tree, the water glinting gold in the sunset. She wore a soft dress, barefoot in the grass, and he grinned like a kid when she reached him. They promised to stand together, not to erase the past, but to face it, side by side. Years on, Echoes of Care thrived, and so did they. Lillian still had shadows, moments when trust faltered, but she had Julian, and he had her. They built a life of quiet mornings and late-night talks, of healing not just for her, but for others. One day, she stood in the library, watching a young woman write a note for Safe Pages, and felt something new: peace. Julian came up behind her, slipping an arm around her waist. "You did this," he murmured. She leaned into him. "We did." And in that moment, she knew. Sometimes the people who hurt you lead you to the ones who help you heal. Not by saving you, but by walking with you until you save yourself.